So thank you everyone for having me at your training, and I would like to speak today about the surveillance of Anopheles mosquitoes. As Dr. Samira mentioned, Anopheles stephensi is very important, but in most of the countries where we're working with the President's Malaria Initiative, we're really focusing on other Anopheles mosquitoes as well. So I'll start out kind of talking about mosquito surveillance in general, and I think probably these are principles that are good for general entomological surveillance, which is focusing on what is your key question, or what is your aim in conducting the surveillance before you start simply doing surveillance activities. And then we'll talk about some of the common techniques for collecting Anopheles mosquitoes, and then move on to a bit more focus on Anopheles stephensi with how do we conduct surveillance for Anopheles stephensi, and then move on to directions for the future. So surveillance of malaria vectors is not a one-size-fits-all activity. It's really something that you need to think about before you start your work, and think what are the key questions that the National Malaria Control National Malaria Control Program needs to answer to better conduct vector control activities. So for example, one of your questions might be, what time are your malaria vectors biting? And does the time that the malaria vectors are biting correspond to the times that people might use mosquito nets? Another question could be, are mosquitoes resistant to the insecticides being considered for control? Or what is the seasonality of malaria vectors populations? Are your vector populations present throughout the year, or are they around at a specific time? And once you've answered those questions, then you need to start thinking about what methods can you use to properly answer the questions that you've defined. So we'll start with just a few examples. Here, I think one of the key questions that you might want to answer is, do the mosquito biting times correspond to the times that you might cover with a mosquito net? So to answer that question, you could collect mosquitoes throughout the night using methods that we'll talk about later. And for example, here you might have a mosquito population that's primarily biting at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning, but not too much in the early evening and not too much in the morning. And you might have a human population that is outside in the early evening, but then around 9 or 10 or 11, they start to go inside and basically stay inside throughout the night until the morning. And so you might put these two sources of information together to find out where are mosquitoes biting your human population. And here you can see that there's not too many mosquitoes that are actually biting early in the evening. So indoor and outdoor, there's not too much biting that takes place there. When your biting really takes place is late at night. And late at night, the human population is inside. So you can see here that all of that biting that we thought was, or that we found when we had collectors indoors and outdoors, that actually the key thing is really the biting is taking place indoors because people are inside. And so you might use this information to see what would happen if you used ITNs. So if you imagine that insecticide treated nets reduce most of the biting that takes place by mosquitoes, then you can really reduce the amount of biting that takes place indoors late at night. And so here you can see that actually using ITNs would substantially reduce your exposure to mosquito bites. But what if you had a different mosquito population? So what if you had a population that was biting primarily in the early evening, but then as the night went on, the biting decreased over time? This might change it. Even if you have the same human population that's outside in the early evening, inside late at night, and then comes back out in the morning, then it looks like most of your biting is taking place outdoors. I don't know if you can you see, let me see if I can, yeah. Most of your biting is taking place still outdoors in the early evening and not so much in the middle of the night. But the time that people use mosquito nets is late at night. So if you control the biting that's occurring here, you can see there's almost no biting taking place there, you actually haven't controlled the biting that's taking place in the early evening. So in this case, using mosquito nets might not really reduce your mosquito biting. So you can see that both the vector biting times and the human behavior combine to help you to understand when people are getting bitten and where they're getting bitten. So let's move to a different example, insecticide resistance. I think many of you have worked on looking at insecticide resistance to see if the insecticides that you're using for vector control are really having an impact. And so in Africa as elsewhere, one of the big questions is using PBO nets. So PBO is a synergist that really reduces resistance when the resistance is based on oxidases in the mosquito. And so some of these new ITNs have PBO on the net. And so when mosquitoes touch the net, they absorb some of that PBO. Their resistance is actually kind of reduced, and then they can be killed by the pyrethroid on the net. So here I'm presenting some results from Congo, and you can see that the gray line is when we exposed mosquitoes to permethrin alone, and the red line is the mortality when we exposed mosquitoes to PBO and permethrin. And you can see that in some sites, the mortality with permethrin alone or with permethrin and PBO is not too far off. You can see that first column, Kingasani, there's not too much difference in mortality between the two. But if you move to the third column and you can see Pawa, you have about 30% mortality with permethrin alone. And when you add PBO, you really have a big increase in mortality. So this is the kind of data that you can help to inform national programs on whether you should use permethrin-treated nets. You have a lot of mortality when it's permethrin alone. Oops, or should permethrin and PBO nets be used? And it can also answer more detailed questions like if you only have enough money to buy PBO nets because they're a little bit more expensive for 4 provinces, which provinces would you use based on the insecticide resistance profile? So for example, for that last question, where would you target to get the biggest amount of benefit for your cost? You might look for areas that have low mortality with permethrin alone, but high mortality when you add PBO. So for example, in Otuele, here you have low mortality in both sites, high mortality with permethrin and PBO. So this might be a good place to use your PBO nets. So that's a way that this surveillance activity can help inform your vector control decisions. And then the other example that we mentioned was seasonality. So when you have the most numbers of mosquitoes around? And it's often quite interesting to compare the times that you have the most mosquitoes around the times that you have the most malaria, because they don't always perfectly correspond. Sometimes you get more malaria later in the season when mosquitoes have had a chance to feed on people, become older, and get the parasites that they need to transmit. And so in some places where you're conducting indoor residual spraying, you know that your indoor residual spraying may last a certain amount of time, for example, 6 months. And you want to know when is the best time to spray that insecticide so that you can control the mosquitoes. So for here, maybe you've collected mosquitoes every month throughout the course of the year, and you know that your mosquito population really starts to increase in February all the way through May, and then it starts to decrease over the rest of the year. So you may want to target your IRS somewhere here so that you can control that big peak in biting. So that's a good use of the data. Sometimes it's not so simple because you may have multiple vector species. And here you have one peak for Anopheles gambi. Here you have another peak for Anopheles pallidus. And you may have a slightly earlier peak for Anopheles funestus. So those are the kind of real life situations that may make the decisions that you have to take more difficult. And sometimes you can do more work to really target the best time. And sometimes you just have to make a decision to use the best information that you have and make the best decision that you have. So we've mentioned the key questions that you want to answer to plan your surveillance activities. But once you have your questions, you need to think about how you can answer those questions. And a lot of times the way that you do that is using mosquito collections methods that are appropriate for your question. Sometimes you want to use different laboratory methods to test your mosquitoes after you've collected them to answer even more complicated questions. And then there's some other methods that you may want to use as well. So in terms of collection methods, in most of the time we use the following collection methods. So human landing collections, Pyrethrum spray catch, CDC Light Trap, Procopak aspiration, and larval sampling. And I'll just go through those briefly. So human landing collection is almost exactly what it sounds like. You're collecting the mosquitoes that land on humans. And so you have collectors that sit outside or inside, and they usually cover up the top half of their body and expose their legs almost as a bait for mosquitoes. And then they can collect the mosquitoes that land on their legs using a tube or aspirator. And yeah, oftentimes you'll have one collector that's sitting inside the house, one collector that's sitting outside the house, so you can answer those questions about where the mosquito is biting. And oftentimes they will keep the mosquitoes that are collected at each hour separate, so they can answer the questions about what time mosquitoes are biting. Oftentimes it's referred to as the gold standard in determining human vector contact, although I think it's quite important that we make the difference that this is when we're talking about collecting malaria vectors. So for malaria, there's good prophylactic drugs. There are good prophylactic drugs and there are safe treatments. And so the risk for people...
Ulay, please make your... Okay, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So there's good ways to protect people from malaria when they're doing human landing collections. So either treating them before so that they don't get malaria, or treating them promptly in the case that they do get malaria. However, this is not the case with all vector-borne disease. I think you're speaking quite a lot about dengue and other Aedes-borne disease, which are not diseases that can be treated prophylactically or necessarily even after the fact. So I want to really emphasize that when you're doing human landing collections, you should consider not only the disease that you're interested in, so for example, malaria, but also any other vector-borne diseases that may be out and about. Because it's important to protect the people that are doing the collections just as you want to protect your general population. And I think that it's also worth mentioning that this is not easy work. When you are sitting in the dark throughout the night, it's easy for collectors to get tired. It's easy for collectors to fall asleep. And so one technique that's used is that you move people on every hour. If you have an indoor collector and an outdoor collector, every hour you can switch them. And that just gives people a chance to get up, move around a little bit, and fight off that sleepiness. Or you can also have a supervisor whose job it is to make sure that people are awake. So that's the human landing collection. The pyrethrum spray catch is often a misnomer because it's a spray catch that was originally done using the insecticide pyrethrum. Most of the time now, it's actually done using a commercial pyrethroid that's easily available on the market. And the way you do this collection is that you go to people who have allowed you to use their house for collections, but usually between 6 and 10 o'clock in the morning. And you block all of the exits as much as possible so that mosquitoes cannot fly out of the house. And you make sure that you remove any food or eating utensils, anything that might be contaminated by a pyrethroid spray. And then you have somebody go in, usually with a mask, and spray the inside of the house. It's kind of spray the insecticide all around the house with the idea that any mosquitoes that are resting inside the house will be touched by the insecticide and then knocked down. And I forgot the most important step. Before you spray the house, you want to make sure that you put white sheets on the ground. And why do you want to use white sheets? Because when those mosquitoes get knocked down and they fall down onto the sheets, you may want to remove them from the house so it's easier to find them. But mosquitoes are much easier to find on white sheets than on dark sheets, just because they're visually easier to see. And so you can see here in this picture, they've gone into the house, put the sheets down, sprayed all inside the house, waited for 10 minutes or so, and then gone inside and carefully collected the sheets, being careful that anything on the mosquito any mosquitoes on the sheets will not fall off when they're brought outside, but will stay on the sheets. And then they lay them flat outside to look for the mosquitoes. And you can see that we have our entomologist is down on the ground looking and collecting the mosquitoes that were knocked down. And he has unexpected assistants who are standing behind him. And oftentimes this is the nice way to communicate to the village where you're working that, mosquitoes rest indoors, and this is how we're collecting them. This is why we're doing this work. And people often get quite interested because they're able to see the mosquitoes as well on the sheets and can say, oh, wait, did you see that one? Did you see that one? And so it's quite a nice way to share your entomological collection with the community. And then, so this is a good way to measure the mosquitoes that are resting inside the house. So the next method is the CDC Light Trap. And the CDC Light Trap is quite simple. It's a small light bulb that gives off a little bit of light. It's powered by a 6-volt battery. And just beneath the light bulb, there's a small fan that's blowing down. And beneath that, you have a kind of a net bag or a collection bag with the idea that mosquitoes will be attracted to the light. Once they get close to the light, the fan will suck them down into the trap, and they'll be blown down into the bag that's just below. So you can see that the light is just right here, the fan is just below it, and then this whole thing hanging down is the net bag. And these traps are very, very transportable, very easy to use. They can be hung inside or outside, which is a nice way to collect indoors and outdoors if you don't want to have humans doing that work all night. And oftentimes when we use them indoors, we can take advantage of people sleeping inside the house to serve as that odor bait for the mosquitoes. So you can hang the light trap often at the foot of the bed net or next to the bed net with the idea that mosquitoes will be attracted into the room to bite the people. If those people are protected by a bed net, the mosquito will fly around and eventually be attracted to the light and go into the light trap. And so this is This is quite a nice method because it's very easy to set up. Oftentimes the most challenging thing is recharging the batteries that you need to use each night. The one thing that we don't exactly know is do light traps collect only host-seeking mosquitoes, or mosquitoes that are resting or that might be flying around inside the room, or mosquitoes that are just flying around and happen to see the light. And so oftentimes it's used as kind of a general population monitoring tool. Obviously, if you put the mosquito net next to a person under a bed net, that indicates that probably mosquitoes were attracted there in the first place by the people under the bed net. And then I'll speak about the Procopak Aspirator. I understand that this may be a new method to many of you. And often in the past, aspirators were big, heavy units that were strapped on like a backpack, had a motor on the back and a big battery. And in recent years, this more lightweight, cheaper model was developed. And I'll show you a video. Hopefully it will be able to show that talks a little bit about the development of this aspirator, and we'll also show you exactly how it's done. But basically what you have is a small cup that has a netting on one side that you put into the unit that has a fan behind it, just like the CDC, that's blowing away. So it's kind of sucking mosquitoes into that cup. And then it's quite a lightweight unit because the person who's using the aspirator actually holds the battery on a backpack, in a backpack or a little satchel that they hold with them. So it allows people to use these extension rods to reach high places. Sometimes they can be quite long, and are a really nice tool for collecting mosquitoes from inside houses. Oftentimes these collections, you want to make them in the morning when mosquitoes are resting inside the house. If you want to standardize your collection, you can standardize the amount of time that a collector is searching for mosquitoes in the house. Because if you have one collector who's collecting for 1 minute and another collector who's searching for 10 minutes, then you could have a lot more mosquitoes in the second one and fewer in the first. And I think it's also noted, especially when houses have walls that are made of mud or other organic materials, the aspirators can become clogged with dust. And so you may need to replace the collection cups frequently. So let me see if I can show you a video.
This program is brought to you by Emory University.
It's estimated that almost half of the population, world populations, is at risk of acquiring a disease transmitted by a mosquito. And the way we can control those diseases is to getting more knowledge about the mosquitoes and the diseases they carry. So we need to do really basic research and advanced research in order to understand them. And that's what we do in our lab.
We use collection caps, which are basically plastic caps with a mesh, a metal mesh. So we can knock the mosquitoes down by place them in the freezer and for 5 minutes. So it's like an anesthesia for mosquitoes. And after that, we can sort them by species and gender and look at different physiological status. If they are blood-fed, they are not blood-fed. For those mosquitoes, in particular for the females, then we can test them for infection, in our case, of West Nile virus in the mosquitoes here in Atlantis. There are many different methods to collect mosquitoes, and those methods were evolving over time. Light traps or gravity traps are devices that have a vacuum or an aspiration and allow mosquitoes that are attracted to a source to be aspirated and contained. Other methods that allow to collect mosquitoes, not when they're attracted, but when they are resting in particular areas. And those are what are called mosquito aspirators, or the most commonly used method is the CDC backpack aspirator. The CDC aspirator is basically a heavy and big backpack that has a motor mounted in the back. So that motor, what it does, it creates a suction channel that basically aspirates mosquitoes into a collection cap. It's really heavy. We're talking about 24 pounds. It's also very expensive, so when you want to buy or obtain one of these aspirators, you're talking about between $500 and $700. And the other limitation is that you're limited about the accessibility of your collection. So you can only reach up to 1.5 meters of distance from the motor. We have this team trying to understand where mosquitoes spend their winter. And given that mosquitoes, where they spend their winter, but also where the virus, West Nile virus, could spend the winter. So we're trying to address that main question. And the idea was that the city of Atlanta has these big tunnels, sewer tunnels, in which not only the mosquitoes would have a shelter, but also optimal conditions, because the conditions inside would be different and more dampened than what happens outside. So we were starting thinking about how we can get the mosquitoes in those tunnels. Of course, we first came up with the use of a CDC backpack aspirator. However, when we are talking about tunnels that can have up to 14 feet high, and ceilings can be really, difficult to reach, and you have some limitations in the surfaces, we have to come up with a different approach. So we have to basically build a new device. We found, actually, motors developed for boats, actually for ventilation of the fumes from the gas tanks, that would fit our needs in terms of weight, cost, and size. So the second step was going to a hardware store and trying to get the other parts that will make up our aspirator. And that was, I think, a very exciting part, because we're just trying to think creatively how using, in our case, paint roller and coupler from plumbing and some wire, how we could come up with this new improved device. The effectiveness tests that we performed here in Atlanta in the combined sewer tunnels, but also in the city of Iquitos, Peru, showed that it's not only cheaper and lighter, but it's also more effective in collecting and detecting mosquito abundance. So we're talking about a price difference of the original $500 or $700 of the backpack aspirator to $50 for our new device. And for us, developing a tool that can be easily accessible for people in developing countries is a key. And we are trying to provide enough information in our paper for other people to build their own aspirator, but also to have a company working in the production of this device, selling these products in a price that can be competitive and easily accessible. The name of the device is called Procopak, and I'll tell you why. Well, my last name is Procopak, of course, and just to say something, the name didn't come from me. It came from other researchers working in the study in Peru particularly. But it came up because of the idea of using a backpack to collect mosquitoes, and given that my name is Procopak, we just combine it and call it Procopak. So at first I made a poll between the students and the people in my lab. They loved it. I also asked another researchers, and everybody said, you can have a nice device, but you also need to have a nice name for the device. And we believe that Procopak would do it. We're sending out some more units to Africa, particularly to Kenya and to Zambia, to test the collections of Anopheles mosquito. Malaria is the most important mosquito-transmitted disease in the world, and we have millions of people affected by it. And although there are new initiatives trying to basically eliminate transmission or interrupt transmission in Africa, there are still many millions of kids dying of malaria in Africa and in the Americas. So vector-borne diseases play a significant role in many different countries in the world. So that's why I believe that those are the diseases that need to be tackled, and the problem we have is how we really face the control of those diseases, particularly because we are dealing with mosquitoes that are really difficult to find, and also to determine where they breed and how they relate to transmission of malaria and other diseases.
Did you catch anything?
I don't know. Let's see. Spiders. Lots of spiders. Shouldn't be afraid of bugs if you want to have this job.
I'll share the link if anybody wants to watch that video. I realized my internet was a bit slow at certain points. And then another method that I'm sure you all know is larval sampling, and that's going out and looking for the mosquito larvae. And this is often done with standard dipping cups, but oftentimes, especially for the major malaria vectors, it can be quite difficult to major malaria vectors in Africa, it can be quite difficult to collect mosquitoes using those cups because either the breeding sites are too shallow or they may have a lot of vegetation, which makes it difficult to dip with the cups. And so you can see here that using materials bought at a market can actually be more effective for sampling larvae. And then once you've collected your mosquitoes, either larval or adult, then you may want to use laboratory methods to better understand their role in transmission of malaria or their insecticide resistance status. And so what's quite nice is that we have circumsporozoite protein ELISA. So I think most of you know the enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay allows you to test mosquitoes. You can cut the head and thorax and then conduct the ELISA to see if that mosquito has sporozoites in its salivary glands or not. So this is a very useful technique when you want to focus your questions on mosquitoes that are actually transmitting malaria. So you may want to see, okay, we know that our mosquito population is biting primarily at night, but are most of the mosquitoes that are actually transmitting malaria biting late at night? And for that, you might want to then collect the mosquitoes and then test them at all the different time periods to see which mosquitoes have the sporozoites. Resistance is a huge issue, especially because we're using so many pyrethroid-treated products and have so much pyrethroid resistance. And so we may want to look for insecticide resistance methods and mechanisms, such as KDR, which confers resistance to pyrethroids. And in Africa, we have one KDR mutation that's called East African KDR and one that's called West African. You may want to look for the ACE1 mutation, which confers some resistance to carbamates and organophosphates. And increasingly, we're looking at other metabolic mechanisms. And then, of course, we have the issues of species complex. And luckily, we have some PCR techniques to determine, once you know that you have an Anopheles Gambi, for example, then you can conduct a PCR to find out which species in the Anopheles Gambi complex do you have. So now to focus more on Anopheles stephensi, I'll speak a little bit about work that we've done in Ethiopia. I was supporting the Ethiopia team as they were conducting Anopheles stephensi monitoring since we first knew that Anopheles stephensi was in country, when Tamar Carter and her group, who she'll be presenting next, found it in 2016. We realized that we needed to adapt other methods to find the best way to collect Anopheles stephensi. And so we started out with our standard collection techniques: human landing collections, Pyrethrum spray catches, CDC light traps, and larval sampling. And we quite quickly realized that some of those techniques were not very good for collecting Anopheles stephensi. And so then we adopted some new methods or alternative methods, focusing on animal-baited collections, because Anopheles stephensi is often quite zoophagic, meaning biting animals. And so we used animal-baited tent traps, as well as aspiration from stables instead of houses. We tried using black resting boxes, so creating a nice habitat for mosquitoes to rest in, and then aspirating from those, as well as using the more traditional pit shelters. So I'll just show you some of those. So human landing catches, you already know what those are. So we conducted those. We used CDC light traps, both indoors and outdoors. We used the Pyrethrum spray catch. So you can see this is our white sheet, and often what happens is your white sheet that starts out very nice, after several uses, it starts to become a little bit yellow, but that's fine. That's no problem. And here's some pictures from actual larval sampling that was done. And you can see that they're sampling a wide range of habitats, and oftentimes habitats that are quite different from what we sample when we're looking for Anopheles arabiensis in Ethiopia. We would never sample tires looking for Anopheles arabiensis. We probably wouldn't even look in these types of metal drums. It doesn't mean they can never be there, but they're not preferred sites. This down here is probably much more what we would have sampled before. But we realized quite quickly that Anopheles stevensii has different larval sites, as Dr. Samira mentioned, and so we had to sample a wide range of sites. We used animal-baited collections. So here you have the animal-baited tent trap. So this is a tent where we kept a cow inside overnight and then collected mosquitoes off the walls of the tent, or just collected mosquitoes off the walls of any kind of animal shelter that we found. So here's a horse stable. And I mentioned the pit shelter earlier. Pit shelter is basically what it sounds like. You dig a big pit in the ground, and because that it is a bit sheltered from the sun, it can create a nice microclimate because a bit more humid with the soil. You can dig out little pockets in the walls of the pit. And so you can hop down there and look for mosquitoes resting inside the pits. And oftentimes it's a good way to get mosquitoes resting outdoors. However, I do want to stress that before you hop down in the pit, make sure you look in the pit to make sure that there's not anything else down in the pit. We've had several cases, not so much recently in Ethiopia, but elsewhere, where other animals have crawled down into the pit. And so you don't want to jump down into the pit if there's already a snake down there or crabs or other creatures. So make sure you look into the pit before you go down. The black box, as I mentioned, was just a cardboard box lined with black fabric with the idea that it'd be nice, dark, and a little bit more humid for mosquitoes to rest inside. And we inspected those in the morning after leaving them in the courtyards all night. And here you can see some of our collection results from 2019 from four different sites. And these are the numbers of Anopheles stevensii that we collected from each site using each method. So quite quickly, you can see that even though we did a number of Pyrethrum spray catches, we only got 4 Anopheles stevensii in Deir Dawa, 29 in Kabir Dahar, 3 in Awash, 9 in Metahara. Using our human landing collection, caught similarly low numbers, 0 in Deir Dawa, 5 in Kabir Dahar, 7 in Awash, and 11 in Metahara. Using the CDC Light Trap, similarly, even though we put out a number of CDC Light Traps, and I'm sorry that I don't have the exact number here, we still caught quite a small number. However, when we collected using hand collections from animal shelters, you can see we got considerably more mosquitoes. The black box was quite interesting because it looked really successful in Deir Dawa, and yet in the other sites, not so much. And similarly, the cattle-baited tent trap was pretty successful in Kabir Dahar, a little bit less successful elsewhere. So I think this was something where we, in looking at the adult results, we said, are there really that many stevensii out there? But when we compared it to the larval searches, we actually found larvae quite in high number of places. So this is one of our questions, is we're still trying to figure out the best way to sample Anopheles stevensii to monitor adult populations in Ethiopia. And that's an ongoing process. And here's just examples of our survey of Anopheles stevensii in a number of sites in Ethiopia. And so here you can see we're sampling different containers like water storage containers, water tanks, stagnant water pools, cement water reservoirs, discarded buckets, and keeping track of the different types of containers helps us to understand the larval sites that are most preferred by Anopheles stevensii. And so here, actually, this is a number of sites that we sampled, mostly in kind of western and southern Ethiopia, where we hadn't sampled before. And actually, we didn't find Anopheles stevensii in most of those, but we did find them in Meki and Zwei, 2 sites where we hadn't found it previously. So at the end, if you're interested, I can show you a map of where we found Anopheles stevensii in Ethiopia so far. And then, of course, Dr. Smira mentioned that it's important to make sure that you're identifying the mosquito correctly. And I think this was one of our big challenges before, because we had a number of excellent entomologists in Ethiopia, but we also had a number of, but nobody had seen Anopheles stevensii before. This is a brand new mosquito species, and so how do we identify it? So as she mentioned, that the WHO put out some key features that I'll show you now. But I also want to note, especially for those of you who are in Africa, that there's a new key for adult females of the Afrotropical region, and that does include Anopheles stevensii now, and that just came out last year. So in the WHO report, they talk about the legs of the mosquitoes and talked about speckled legs. And this is something that both Anopheles gambi or arabiensis both have speckled legs. So here you can have Anopheles gambi, you can see the speckled legs. And here you have Anopheles stevensii, also speckled legs. So the speckling on the legs is not something that you can use to tell the 2 species apart. However, and this gets a bit more technical, so bear with me. On Anopheles gambi, there's a white spot in the 2nd dark area and the 3rd dark area of the wing. And you can see that here. Here, that 2nd dark area is kind of blending into this a bit. But here, that right underneath my cursor there is a very clear interruption in that dark area, which is very, very familiar to those of you who look for gambi quite regularly. Anopheles stevensii actually has 2 spots in this 2nd dark area, but none in the 3rd dark area. So if you look here, you can see this dark area. There's 1 interruption there, and similarly to this photo, the 2nd one is kind of blending into the border between the dark area. And if you look in this area, there's no interruption. So with gambi, there's an interruption there on the 3rd dark area. With stevensii, no interruption. And then also when you look at the palps, there's slight differences in the banding of the palps. So here you have the mosquito head, you're looking from above, and you can see the proboscis coming out here, and then the 2 palps coming out to either side. And you can see that this is the apical band, the band at the very apex of the palps, and it's quite long, or it's it's good size. But then the subapical, which means the next to the last band, is quite narrow for Anopheles gambi. So you have kind of a decent sized band here, but then a narrow band before that, white band before that. However, when you look at Anopheles stevensii, you have this similar kind of broad band at the apex, or the apical band is quite large and pale. And then you actually have another subapical band, pale band, that's almost the same length as the apical one. So I hope you can see that. So you can see here, these 2 bands are almost the same. These 2 bands are almost the same. And here you have a wide one and a narrow one. Here you have a wide one and a narrow one. So looking at the palps is another way that you can distinguish between those 2. And I just want to re-emphasize that this is just when you're comparing mosquitoes that you know are either a gambi or gambi complex or stevensii. If you have identification keys for your country, please use those keys and please make sure that stevensii is in there. and then you can follow those to identify the mosquito. So I think I'll stop there. I can actually zoom ahead. I have some quiz questions, but I'll just show you a map of Ethiopia, and this is some of our surveillance results. So all of these orange spots are areas where we have found Anopheles stephensi adults or larvae. So you can see it's mostly in the eastern part of the country so far. And all of these black spots are areas where we looked for Anopheles stephensi but actually didn't find it. I think this is something that we obviously have a lot of collaboration to do with our neighboring countries, Djibouti, Somalia, and Sudan, because we want to know where Anopheles stephensi is being found in those countries. As Dr. Samira mentioned, EMRO is doing a fantastic job of coordinating those communications. So I think I'll stop there. I have some quiz questions. I don't know if Samira, you want me to go through those now, or?
I think it's better to be shared.
Hamoud, is it okay? Go through the questions?
Yeah, he have more 10 minutes. Can go through them. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just go through the quiz questions, and I'll go quickly so you don't see the answers. Okay, so the first quiz question is, and I guess you can just answer in the chat box, is what do you think about before you plan your entomological monitoring activity? Good. Yeah, it looks like people are already answering a question.
Yeah.
You want to think about the reason of the monitoring or the objective of the study. Very good comment about the availability of logistics and funding is very important. Good. I see the question from let's see, from Jimale Hassan about larval identification of Anopheles stephensi. That's an excellent question. We currently don't have an updated key for African Anopheles that includes stephensi, but that's definitely something that we need. So I'll move on to the next question. Good. Think about the question. Make sure the activities that you're planning to do will answer the question. Okay. And what are common adult collection methods for Anopheles mosquitoes? You can answer in the chat. Good, good. Great. I see. Yeah, it looks like everybody's getting good answers. I saw two questions. One from Khalid Saurur from Sudan about does entomological monitoring help in vector-borne disease control or not? And I think that the answer is it can. It doesn't necessarily. And that's because it's really up to you to choose the questions in your entomological monitoring that answer the key questions that you need to make good vector control decisions. If if you already know all the answers to your questions, you may not need to do much entomological monitoring. But if there's questions that you have that you don't know the answer to, and some of these things can change, like insecticide resistance or even biting times can change, you may want to think about doing entomological monitoring to do that, to look at that. And then there was another question about, yeah, mosquitoes starting to bite at 4 p.m. when bedtime is 8 p.m. I think this is a huge question, is how do you control mosquitoes that are biting outdoors? And I think that's a very difficult question. And I mean, I think you can refer to WHO guidance on that. You know, larval control may be useful for controlling mosquitoes if you know the habitats and can do the work. Sometimes methods that are controlling mosquitoes indoors can actually have an impact on outdoor biting as well. Good. Okay. The next question is, what other collection methods were used for Anopheles stephensi in Ethiopia? Besides the standard collection methods, what other methods did we use? Good. Black box. Animal beta collection. Perfect. Good. I'll just respond quickly to the question from Salahuddin Khan Marwat. So in the presentation, we were giving a kind of a fictional example of how you might look at ITN utilization and mosquito biting times to determine the impact of your ITNs. For IRS, I think that's a very good question. And I think you could do something similar. They're a little bit different in terms of, you know, IRS is killing the mosquitoes that are coming to rest on the walls. But I think you could do something, a similar type of activity, assuming that, you know, for example, IRS was protecting people when they were indoors or killing the mosquitoes that were coming indoors. You could do a similar type of model for IRS. Okay, I'll move on to, I think this is my last question. What are the key second to last question. What's the key, oh, good, thank you very much. What are the key morphological similarities between Anopheles gambi and Anopheles stephensi? Good. Speckled legs, perfect. Good. And last question, more complicated. What are the key morphological differences between Anopheles gambi and Anopheles stephensi? This is a good question for the taxonomists who are in the audience. Good. Dark area on the wing. Wing spots, good. Good, and the palps. Very good. I'll just show the image again. Yeah. So very good job, guys. And thank you so much for letting me present.